Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Koka Report. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Koka himself, and I will let him introduce himself and tell us about what's brought him to where he is. Dr. Anish, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm a cardiologist in private practice in Philadelphia.
Yeah. So I'm a little curious. You were born in India?
Oh, that far back. Yes, I was born in India.
Okay. And how old were you when you came to the U.S.?
I was 10 years old.
Okay. To Pittsburgh?
Yeah, to Pittsburgh, yes.
Pittsburgh. Okay. And you grew up there. Went to medical school where?
I went to medical school at Temple in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Temple is in North Philadelphia. It serves it's in a great training environment.
Okay. And did your residency there as well?
Yep, I did my residency there. I did a year of chief residency there, and then I went just down the street on Broad Street a little bit.
You're very adventurous.
The only places I can get in. I was limited. So I went to Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson for my cardiology fellowship.
Okay. And then you stayed there you established your private practice in the neighborhood.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've essentially stayed right around Jefferson.
Okay. And you're married, you have 4 children?
Yes, I'm married with 4 kids ranging from 14 to 2.
Okay. So. Your wife is a physician too?
She is. She's an oncologist.
Okay. And where did you meet? In residency or?
We met in residency.
Okay.
So.
Residency. Is she also from the Philadelphia area?
She is. Yeah. She actually was born and raised in the Philadelphia area. She's in.
You guys are like, nestled in Philadelphia.
I know.
This is great. It's very endearing. I find it very endearing.
But it's good if I had actually escaped from not that I like Pittsburgh and I like Pennsylvania. So, but even if I had escaped from the clutches of Pennsylvania, would never met. Life would be very different.
I think there's a lot to say to localism, right? Yeah. I mean, if I'm a localist. I think it's good to develop. You chide me about appealing to the idyllic community. Right, that can take care of healthcare without resorting to the government. If everybody stayed, in their place of birth or where they grew up, I think that'd be easier to bring it on and bring it about. Yes, bring it about. So we're going to talk about. You have a lot of very strong opinions about conflicts of interest, and your piece, your terrific piece of investigative journalism / healthcare analysis about the hospital readmission program policy exemplifies that. But you've written quite a bit, over the years and tweeted and so forth on this question of conflicts of interest. One thing that comes through is that you think that it's unfair to put so much emphasis on personal financial conflict of interest as opposed to everything else. And there are conflicts of interest and biases that pervades, throughout healthcare. And if we only highlight one at the expense of the others or at the exclusion of the others, it's a disservice. Tell us, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's always been. It seemed to me in the last 4 or 5 years that at least I've become sentient to the fact that there's a lot of arguments that are invalidated simply because of conflict of interest. And this is kind of seen a lot in the ProPublica New York Times pieces that run frequently about dollars that physicians get for, say, drug lunches or dollars that physicians get for speaking. And, there's a lot of guilt by association. So if you are somebody that is a speaker for a drug, or you're somebody, then, what you say is automatically suspect. If you are a researcher that is testing a drug that's funded by a company, then automatically what you say is suspect.
Right. But
And
it's plausible.
yeah, no, it's absolutely plausible.
And beyond plausible, I think they show studies, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's data to support the fact that these kinds of financial arrangements can, in fact, bias,
Well,
the way the science is reported.
well, I would say that the data shows correlations between more funding,
Hmm.
sorry, more, more drug lunches, say, and the fact that physicians may prescribe more. It shows correlations between positive outcomes of research and funding. But that extra step that you're making in that statement, that's implied, is that this is causal. And while some of that certainly may be causal, what happens is, I think you say that it's causal in a blanket fashion that necessarily invalidates everyone that takes anyone that has those financial links. And I don't know that that's true. And again, if I was sitting outside this sphere, I think I would feel the same way as many people reading the New York Times or reading the latest ProPublica article that says that, my God, look how much this physician is making because they do this. And I would probably think the same thing. But I think but when you're living through it, it becomes clear that the actual lay of the land is far more complex than that simple narrative.
Okay, but so let me ask you: are you saying that? Well, what if you wanted to judge whether um, a particular financial relationship actually caused a problem downstream? You would say, well, let's look at the scientific public, positions on their own term, on their own merit,
Yeah.
and determine if the research is sound, and then
Yeah.
who cares, who funded it, or whether the researcher is in the pocket of pharma and that sort of thing. Would that be your position,
Well,
or do you,
I mean, that in an ideal world where we have a truth machine that tells us what the truth is, then yes, if scientific analysis could live on its own, without question, then absolutely. But the problem is that, as we've shown and we've talked, we spoke to Brian Nosek on a great podcast earlier. I wrote a blog about statistical certainty and how it doesn't really exist. Um, as the researcher, you can choose paths that lead you to a certain a conclusion, whether that be consciously or unconsciously. So I think there isn't a good answer for what you're asking. I think it's very, very, very hard to figure out whether or not um, this correlation that is being pointed out in terms of financial dollars being received, and whether or not that's adversely impacting judgment or that's adversely impacting outcomes. I think it's very hard to show that link.
yeah, but well, let's make it concrete. Let's take the example of the head of research at Sloan Kettering.
Right.
I forgot his last name.
Baselga.
Basilica, right? A huge story. So what's your position on this? He was sacked for failing to disclose financial relationships according to the
Yeah.
way some people thought they ought to be disclosed.
Look, I think at least based on what I've read about it, and I don't know much about Baselga. I don't know much about how he practiced. I don't know, I don't know what about his practice patterns, how appropriate it was that he was prescribing things, or how appropriate the research that he did was. But what I know about it, the bare bones that I know about it, which is what you get from reading the ProPublica article on it, or the New York Times article on it, is that he didn't disclose the fact that there were dollars received based on the sale of a company or something like that, and because of that, he was fired. Now, none of that goes to. I mean, what did he do wrong? Like, what did he do wrong? Yes, he violated. He potentially may have violated a rule regarding disclosure. It could be an oversight. It may not have been malicious. Number one, but number two, what I don't understand what exactly is violating from a standpoint of harming greater society or patients. Like, in order for him to be fired or let go, I think you have to show that the research that he did was horribly biased, or that, meaning he arrived at conclusions that were wrong, or arrived at conclusions that are very suspect, or that his practice pattern was grossly affected in a bad way, meaning he prescribed drugs that weren't indicated, and you can't figure out, like, why are you doing this, right? That's what you have to show, and none of those articles get to that.
Yeah, but I mean, to the point that you were making earlier, is precisely because you cannot show these things, individually. You cannot make that final step. That it seems that the prudent thing to do is, precisely to avoid having any kind of financial ties, or if you do have financial ties, to be as transparent as possible. Because the idea is that these conflicts, subconsciously, just pervade your thoughts and influence how you're going to conduct yourself and conduct your research. And therefore, you should, the minimum that people ask is disclosure, and many people ask for refraining from actually receiving any money personally. What's wrong with that? That sounds plausible to me. And then Memorial Sloan Kettering has the reputation of its own to defend, and therefore it's taking what seems to be a rational step to preserve its name and reputation, which is sacking the chief.
But I think the details matter a lot. I think you're speaking in a very broad sense. So yeah, I don't in general have an issue with transparency. Honestly, I do have an issue with transparency now, because unfortunately it proves the point that unless you have people that understand what information they're getting, I don't think they know what to do with the data. All right. So, for instance, in this Baselga thing, right? Again, the details matter a lot here. There's a lot of excessive spin. There's a lot of spin and innuendo, and it's because these guys put the splashy things saying that there's $3.5 million that was given that is not disclosed, right? But you find out that most of that money, right, everything but like $50,000 of that was related to Baselga's equity stake in a certain company, right? And that equity stake in a certain company after a sale, that was about that. Roche acquired the company, and when Roche acquired the company, Baselga's equity stake in that was $3.4 million. Now, was he supposed to report that in 2014? Again, this is very, very different than like somebody handing cash to a guy and the guy not disclosing that this is being given. So, I think it's shameful what happened to Baselga. I mean, I know some of the details of this case because it was such a big, it splashed out, it was splashed everywhere. But I don't think that's reasonable, right? Unreasonable, right? I mean, you have Baselga here who may have helped design a drug called, I think, Herceptin, which is a drug that is used as a standard of care. Nobody argues about the effectiveness of Herceptin in folks that are receptor positive or whatnot. And so why should a guy who helped develop that drug not stand to gain a significant amount financially from that, right? If an orthopedic surgeon designs a new hip and that hip starts being used a lot because it is better than the old one, why should we have a problem with the royalties that are paid to him? Or if he designs a company and the company gets sold and he gets a large amount of money, I don't have a problem with that. And how exactly you disclose that? Okay, fine. You give him a slap on the wrist for not disclosing the fact that he had an equity stake of $3.4 million. But why should he resign from Sloan Kettering for helping design a drug and selling part of his equity stake and making $3.4 million from that? I see no reason for that.
I agree, but it's because we live in a particular culture that, well, first of all, there's a little bit of ambiguity in his position, right? So he is not the employee of the pharmaceutical company. In a way, if he were the employee of the pharmaceutical company or the owner, right? If he had founded a pharmaceutical company, made this drug, and made money from it, in the mind of the gallery, it would be a little bit clearer where he stands. Whereas here, he stands as ostensibly a more impartial and less invested head of research at a cancer center, who allegedly, according to the rules of the game, right, is an independent researcher who's designed the drug. But he is not in it for the money. I mean, that's the presumption of the culture and the presumption of the setup of having non-profit academic centers and non-profit research centers is that they're there. So I'm not defending that presumption, but I'm saying that the presumption is there.
Right. No, I mean, Sloan Kettering is certainly within their right to fire him, but I mean, look, what's going to happen is that you're going to have a separation between academia and the private sector. Baselga has now gone on to become head of, research head of, I think, one of the pharma companies, and it's fine. I mean, and if we think that, and I guess it's for the clinicians and the physicians at Sloan Kettering to say whether or not that's a loss for the academic community or not. I tend to think that removing guys like Baselga from the academic community, from grand rounds, from whatever it is he participates in, from teaching, etc. I think that's a loss for the academic community. But I so I don't.
It's but I think to me it may be there's no reason. The problem is. Academia is now there's a lot of basic research that is subsidized by taxpayers, right? It's the NIH funding a lot of this research that ends up getting scooped up by pharma, right? Who end up then making a lot of money. It's not a very healthy arrangement as far as I'm concerned.
No, but again, if the NIH could bring it to market and do all this, I mean, the NIH, if they could do what pharma was doing, they could perhaps do this themselves. But of course, we have regulatory barriers that are set up that don't allow that to happen. So what do we do? We want drugs to come to market. We have a system set up that's in place as it is. I mean, there's a lot of work that's done after the basic science part of it. So I don't.
Yeah, right. I'm not saying that pharma is not doing anything, and it's not, they're not reaping their, due reward. Yeah. Although, again, the system is so rigged in many different ways that pharma benefit, in all likelihood, benefits out of proportion to what its due reward is, and so forth. But it's a treacherous. Environment, and I suspect, and he may have realized that he was unwise in not disclosing.
Absolutely, I'm sure he wished he had disclosed
that thing. Right, he probably wished he had disclosed, and but it doesn't get to the bottom of. So then, the problem is that. The ideal thing really is for people like him not to receive any money really. At all. But the problem is that if he doesn't receive any money, then he's really penalized financially compared to a lot of peers who then would be people like us making a lot more money than a researcher like him, even though he's providing a lot more for mankind in a way, right?
No, so totally crazy, Michel, because this is what's happening in the world of, I mean, as I understand it, and hopefully guys like David Shaywitz won't think I'm too wrong in terms of my understanding of what's going on, is that you have these VC funds that are essentially investing, billions of dollars, and I guess they get equity in return for that, right? And then, the final payout comes when some larger company gobbles up that company, and the payouts are large. Now, consider that the people that are doing the work, I'm not talking about the VC guys that are running around like deciding where to put, billions of other people's money is. The guys who are sitting in labs and, who have this deep understanding of biology, of where the field is, how to push the field forward, right?
It's a very thankless job, right?
Yes.
They put a lot of hours, very thankless job.
Yeah. And so everyone wants to talk about Baselga and his $3.5 million. Michel, what was the equity stake that gave him $3.5 million?
Yeah.
It was 0.5%.
Right.
His equity stake was 0.5%. There are a lot of people that made a lot of money off of the research that really Baselga, off of Baselga's work and his deep understanding of stuff, we're really going to deny, the physician who was probably close to the epicenter of this happening, we're going to deny him 0.5% of the entire thing? It's come on, it's utterly absurd and ridiculous.
It is absurd, but at the same time, so I go back to the point that I was making earlier, is that with the my problem is not that the NIH should be doing what pharma is doing. Is on the contrary, is that pharma should be doing what the NIH is funding, and instead of the NIH funding this, all this money should be funded by pharma. So pharma should fund its own basic research.
Yeah,
and the scientists who are interested in that should be employed by pharma, and then or set up their own private companies from the get-go, rather than having these publicly funded research centers that make everything more murky, because then they're not. So on the one hand, you want them to be rewarded. You want the people who work at these nonprofit centers to be rewarded. On the other hand, they are nonprofit and therefore disinterested and objective and all that stuff, and it's really untenable. Or it's very hard to maintain. I mean, you can't have a rational rule by which you reward uninterested researchers working at nonprofit academic centers, which are really massively funded by the NIH. Massively funded, but most of their funding comes from the taxpayers, and that's the source of a problem, and it's intractable. And the disclosures are not going to help, except to allow the New York Times and ProPublica to do their investigative work and find out who's not following the rules.
Yeah, I would say the right response is to make the New York Times and ProPublica much less important. I mean, I would say that the idea that we have these marauding journalists that allow for guilt by association.
But so therefore you want to curtail freedom of speech?
No.
How are you going to make them less important? I'm sorry, right?
But by not paying attention to what they say. I mean, do you know what? I have no idea what. But they're because I don't pay any attention to them. So I think,
but you're not being. But they're very influential. I mean, a lot of people read the New York Times.
Yeah, and
even though it's according to Trump, it's a failed. The failed New York Times has a very, very wide readership.
Yeah.
And people who donate to Memorial Sloan Kettering are New York Times readers.
Yep.
And it matters to them.
Yeah,
so
and
I don't know how you're going to make the influence of the New York Times go away.
Well, by saying that they're utterly wrong, and not everything that's printed in the New York Times is is from the word of.
All right, we're pushing. So anybody listening to this, please give us a good rating on iTunes so the Koka and Koka report can can grow and we can start competing with the New York Times. All right, but so that's for personal financial conflict of interest. The flip side of the coin is that what you brought up in your blog is that the ideological conflicts of interest can be very important and perhaps even more important. And I think you make a very cogent point about that. There's no question about it in my mind,
right.
Especially when it has to do with the design of healthcare policy, which affects millions of people, billions of dollars, and so forth. So how should we regulate those conflicts of interest?
No, I don't.
Or deal with them, or.
I think the point I was trying to make. So for the folks, the blog I wrote was on the hospital readmission reduction program, and there were many lessons from this program. It was a program that was designed by essentially some policy wonks, and those policy wonks thought it was a good idea to penalize hospitals that had high readmission rates, 30-day readmission rates. And they had a number of different diagnoses, but the one that I focused on the blog was the heart failure readmission penalty. And specifically, this was announced in 2010, it was rolled out in 2013, and it resulted in a large number of hospitals on a yearly basis being penalized. And penalized to the extent that Medicare was able to recover about $2 billion over the course of the 4 or 5 years that the program's been running. Again, the policy wonks that that have been on the warpath in terms of saying we need to focus on readmissions essentially came from the ideology that said that, look, we have a fee-for-service system, a volume-based system that gives no incentive for hospitals to really go after the things that make people come back to the hospital. And so if we had a good, healthy health system, we would make sure that patients did not need to be readmitted to the hospital. And that they said was a good metric for value. And so they set up a system which penalized folks that had higher readmission rates. The details
penalized hospitals, right?
Yeah, hospitals that had high
and indeed, readmissions went down after once the law was passed.
Right, we think so.
And right, it's hard to tell, but it seems that the readmissions went down.
Yes.
And but unfortunately, at the same time, mortality from heart failure started to go up, whereas it had been going down for many years prior to the announcement. Again, it's all murky because when you do the analysis, as you show in your piece, that it's impossible to come up to any kind of final conclusion on these things.
Right. But it's such a fascinating little example of how you have different folks analyzing sometimes the exact same data set and coming
so the folks who designed the policy were then at the same time were tasked to analyze the outcomes of the policy and said, lo and behold, no problem here. It's all good. The policy is working. Whereas other folks who are less invested in the policy and who happen to be more, are many of them are clinicians, who have sort of a lived experience of what happens to heart failure patients who need to be readmitted and so forth.
Right.
They analyzed the same data set and said, no, there's a problem here. Mortality has been going up, whereas it had, prior to that had been going down. So it's equally plausible here that non-personal financial conflicts of interest play a huge role in the way the science is promulgated, the way the policy is rolled out, and so forth, and the impact on society at large, is very important. It cannot be minimized.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful example, and of how folks that are not getting enriched by transfers into their own personal bank accounts really can have major impact. And you don't see this often in policy, because more than often we have a very monotonic healthcare policy that's guided by these large factories that graduate these
policy wonks.
Policy wonks, and they all, a lot of them kind of say the same basic thing, and they all echo each other. And so it's a rare thing to see this. And I think I said in the piece that this may happen. It's clearly the case that policy is not a good enterprise to give you a definite answer, and that we're seeing this happen here because there are two sides, two vested interests that are somewhat different, and therefore they're analyzing the same thing and arriving at different conclusions. And so it's really, really interesting in terms of showing how important non-personal financial bias is. And it's also the point that So the two things I brought out was the fact that there's clearly an ideological bias on the designers of this group, because the designers of the policy of readmissions had also, as far back as 2003, had written articles in the peer-reviewed press about how important it was to attack.
Right, and I'll say, so 15 years ago, they had published a piece saying that, declaring that hospitals are clearly not interested in improving the quality of heart failure care, because if they did improve the quality of heart failure care, readmissions would go down, and they would lose money, and they would have empty beds, right? So so clearly hospitals, and it's a very simplistic sort of view of I mean, I'm not saying that hospitals are the holy grounds that they ought to be, but it's clearly very simplistic. And so if they're motivated by this ideology, if they have this view of how hospitals operate and react to the management of diseases, then you can see how that would sort of color everything else that they do.
Exactly. So they produce policy, and then lo and behold, like you're saying, they then have to design,
and they get a fair amount of. I mean, so you say it's not personal financial conflicts of interest, because the money the grants that they receive, these wonks, they don't go necessarily. But they do employ them personally, so at least their salary. I mean, they're on. they don't have a commission on the basis of a policy, but they do. The grant money is fairly hefty.
Right,
You
right,
know,
right.
and
So,
tens or maybe
right,
hundreds of millions of
right.
dollars
Right, right. So
for
that's
this
the crazy thing
center.
about this story was that yes, there's this ideological bias, and then you kind of discover that it's more than just ideological bias. It's that the designers of the policy are also being, funded to a really, really significant degree by Medicare to create this policy. So the grant money. I mean, I think I spoke to some people, and they told me that the average NIH grant is around $1.5 million or something like that. I mean, that makes people very excited. And then the amounts here we're talking about, I think for the MIDS, for the developing an instrument, there's a special program called the MIDS MIDS program. The grant for over 6 years was $83 million. That's just one of the grants that was received. There were other grants that were received as well. So the amounts we're talking about are massive, and none of them are going, as you're saying, directly into somebody's bank account, but they are, I'm sure, supporting salaries, of course. But I mean, I didn't get down to
Right.
the detail of knowing what exactly
Right,
the salaries
and
were.
it
So.
right, they're supporting salaries and of researchers, and presumably it's not like the research that they do to analyze the data is capital intensive, that they need to buy large
Right,
pieces of equipment, right?
right, right,
So
right.
it seems
Yeah,
uh,
but see, so getting back to the first 20 minutes of our conversation here in terms of conflict of interest and not necessarily invalidating people just because they have a conflict of interest. It's a good thing that smart people who do work for the government are get paid for the work that they do. So it's not enough to just say, well, they received a lot of money. What they said is invalidating. What's so special about this little event here, this little saga here, is the fact that you can actually get a sense that these folks are choosing to land on one side of the conclusions here, because of what may be happening here. Because why it's so strange that other groups that look at it come up with a different conclusion. Yet these folks over and over and over again come up with a different set of ideas. And the other interesting thing is that part of the retort from this group, the designers of the policy, one of the retort is basically that, well, you can't prove that this is causing the heart failure mortality to go up because none of the data sets are designed to prove anything. They're just large data sets. We're doing retrospective
it's
analyses.
correlation, not causation, right?
Yeah, but yet the same group, confidently says, hospital readmissions have been associated with reduced mortality. So it's so it seems to me so obvious that in this particular case, you have met the bar for kind of saying, hey guys, something seems a little fishy here, because you are consistently coming down on the other side of things, and there's a significant amount of funding that you've received. So whether it be
Right, so I grant you that. I mean, it's very plausible that there's an inherent bias,
right,
both ideological and
right,
and financial,
right,
to
right,
some extent, that is of equal importance as
right.
far as society is concerned.
Which is huge. Which you would think is not a big deal. I mean, it's like, okay, the water is wet, fine. So, but the crazy thing is there's some super. I mean, so, Vinay Prasad, oncologist in Oregon, who's an EBM expert, says all the time that financial COI is like smoking and cancer. It's like everyone that talks about anything that's not financial COI is minimizing financial COI, and it's done to it's done to take people's eye off the ball. But here, I mean, here's a clear example of where non-financial COI is seemingly incredibly important.
Right. Although, so let me try to play devil's advocate here, because let's say, we started off by saying that, or you started off by saying that, in the case of personal financial gain to researchers who then develop drugs that have or certain clinical, that it's very hard to make the final leap, that their gain led to them drawing some conclusions in one way or another. you could make the case as well here, or you should, to be consistent. You could say, well, you're identifying potential or plausible biases, right? The wonks have analyzed the data in their own way, but it's not. I mean, the way they've analyzed the data is not completely, irrational, or I mean, it's defensible in a certain sense, right? I mean, it's been peer reviewed and it's defensible.
Yeah. No, I
And
agree.
so you should, if you're going to give the other guys, the benefit of the doubt, on the pharma side, you should give the wonks the benefit of the doubt on the policy side and say, so how do you resolve that problem at the end of the day?
Yeah, and I think it requires a very detailed, diligent approach to things, because in this particular case, you have if you read their paper, the policy designers, if you look at their paper, where they say, one of the things they say is that there's no mortality. We cannot find an inflection point, meaning the mortality rates did go up, but the mortality rates in heart failure were going up even before. And so therefore the mortality rates have just been going up in a straight line, right? But in order to see whether or not that's true, you have to look and see whether there's an inflection point between pre-announcement of the penalty and post-announcement. And the analysis that the policy designers themselves shows that the mortality rate, the slope in terms of mortality before and after is different, right? The p-value for that change in terms of whatever risk-adjusted thing is 0.11. And based on that, they say there's no statistically significant change.
Yeah, but they're applying
But so what they're doing, Michel, is that they're looking at the same data set, they're seeing the mortality rise, but they are then writing a conclusion that says, oh, this is not statistically significant. Michel, I'll give you another thing. Suppose that in 2010, there were 400 heart failure deaths in a local town, okay? Say in 2014, when you looked at it again, there were 800 heart failure deaths, all right? Now, I can go to some statistician and say, hey, this is in 2010, this is in 2018. Is this a statistically significant increase? And the stats folks will do whatever, risk adjust whatever, and say, yes, no, maybe so. But in the end of the day, this is not something. There's no when deaths go up, you don't care so much about the statistical significance of it. What you care about is this rise clinically significant, and why is it happening? So what you have here is an example of folks that are minimizing something that everyone is seeing. They're just writing it a different way. So that's
again, I'm going to be on the devil's advocate, because here you're trying to address the problem by technical analysis, right? So you're putting in your own technical analysis, and you're saying that they are minimizing, that their conclusions minimize what the data actually shows.
That's very strange.
Right. Well, it's very strange, but the same kinds of arguments happen all the time. I mean, it's the dispute about the statins and whether the statins are good. It's the same sort of thing.
Well, no, that's not. If you're gonna, how's the same?
But I mean, at the end of the day, you cannot draw a firm conclusion because of statistics.
No.
Statistics never give you those kinds of certainty. So you cannot never draw the kinds of conclusions. They will tend to emphasize that
yes. But
money has been saved, and they will say we don't see, we don't seem to see, statistically significant. And they are in, as far as I can tell, as a neophyte, they seem to be in their right to draw those conclusions. Their paper went through peer review. If there was a clamor of other, if it was retracted at the end of the day, that tons of people looked at their paper and then it was retracted, then you could say, well, maybe they. But otherwise, it's the normal peer review scientific education process that is going on, right?
I don't think it's I really don't think it's the same thing. I think it's relatively clear that they are resting that they could have taken the same analysis they did. And written conclusions are very different, because, I mean, again, the p-value. By the way, the p-value is 0.11. Is that something? Does that invalidate the chance? So, and here's the second point, Michel. So we can talk about the technical analysis, and I don't think it's like statins. By the way, I think this is there's no doubt that mortality has gone up, right? The policy designers are saying that
It has gone up, but it didn't go up faster than it was going up even before
going
the
up
policy was
before,
announced.
even
Right.
though their own paper shows that with a p-value of 0.11, there is a mortality rate difference, right?
Right. That the slope starts to rise faster. Right. The slope
Yeah,
is
this is
more
not.
steep.
I mean, I don't think there's not. And then so it's silly to me when that happens to then say, well, it's not statistically significant. So if there are more heart failure deaths that are happening, and it seems to be happening at a more rapid rate. They are then writing it. The only way that you can get around that is to say, all right, well, statistically, it's not significant. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that over and over again, publicly, these folks continue to clamor and say that they are the only ones that can say anything definitive from the data set. So Michelle, I don't think I would have written the blog, or I certainly wouldn't have written that piece of the blog the way I did, if the policy designers said, you know what, it is plausible that mortality has gone up. We don't believe so. They don't say that. They say there is no link. They're definitive. And they say there's no link. And they look at the other data sets and the other research that has been done and say, no, there are holes in your data. There's this hole in that data. There's this hole in that data. I don't know about this. They essentially try to invalidate the other research that's done. So they're not making the claim that they're not making the claim that you're making. They're saying that, well, we can't really tell anything that's plausible. That's certainly a plausible thing. And what our analysis has shown, the mortality rate's not going up, and
okay, so they're hyping their interpretation to the max, right? They're making it definitive when they ought to be making it sort of tentative.
Yeah. Okay. So they're right. Not. So that's
okay. So what you're doing now with your blog, I tweeted that. I said you're channeling Charles Ornstein, right? You're channeling ProPublica. You're doing your own version of the New York Times, right? You're doing some kind of rabble rousing in a way. I mean, you don't say it that way, but that's what you're doing. You're agitating to point out some problems, and it's fine. I mean, I have no.
But the
no disagreement with that. What's the distinction there?
The distinction between Ornstein, the New York Times, ProPublica, and me is that I think I've done a lot of work. And again, I actually didn't do it. The investigators that did the opposing analyses and whatnot, I mean, they did the hard work.
But you've pulled it together.
No, I know, but they're the ones that were key and instrumental in kind of demonstrating some of the hypocrisy that exists here. Meaning, you can't just say hey, he's gotten paid, therefore it's bogus. You have to go in, read the papers, compare the analyses, and then look at and then take a look at what is publicly going on in terms of how it is they're saying. Look, the problem is that in order for research funding to continue, in order for this whole kind of operations which says that we can get more value for less dollars, right? That's the whole intent of all of these top-down policies when it comes to our current healthcare system. We need to give policymakers and politicians. So not policymakers. We need to give the politicians, the ones who write the checks in our system, we need to give them the confidence to keep writing us checks, right? And you can't go to those guys and say, well, our thing may work, but it may not. Our thing may have caused heart failure to go down, but it may not. It may have caused heart failure to go up. Like, that does not inspire any confidence. So my point is that there's a clear incentive afoot here in order to do this, and you very rarely have the ability to show, based on the fact that there are other groups that are analyzing the same data, you very rarely can see that the same data set, you're getting very different conclusions. And in that case, when that happens, then all of a sudden you start to wonder about these things.
I agree with you, but I think that's true across the board, meaning a researcher in an academic research center like Memorial Sloan Kettering, who's getting not money from VC funds, but money from the NIH.
It's plausible.
It's going to be very, have the same kind of incentives.
It's plausible. If ProPublica wanted to write that thing on Baselga, what they needed to do was to go analyze the papers and say, all right, in these particular papers, this is very weird. Why is this happening? Why are they doing this? They did not do that. They didn't do that at all. They didn't. I mean, there's not one reference to. I mean, I don't know if they actually read any of the papers that Baselga wrote. Right. I want to know what Baselga did that was irregular. all right? And you do not get a single sense from reading a single thing that they read, that ProPublica and New York Times wrote about what it was that Baselga did that was irregular. The only thing that was irregular was that he took money. By that metric, then, my blog would have been 1,000 words. Right. It was like, Harlan Krumholz, Dr. Krumholz took, this much money, and therefore you should not listen to him. No, you have to go about showing how and why these things were irregular. And to, Vinay Prasad has done this a fair amount in terms of doing that, right? So to his credit, he gets into the weeds of, say, the heart failure paper, and he says, look, why did they do a run-in? And he throws shade at, the run-in was done for this reason. Now, and again, that's the debate to have, but you have to have that level of, I think, insight in order to make those claims. And so otherwise what's happening is just, trash.
Correct. But imagine, I mean, how can you have, if that's going to be the standard by which, but how can you even muster the manpower to verify and double check? So I disagree. I mean, I think
if you don't have the manpower, then you just put out crappy work. That's not the case. Right?
Well, that's right. So that's the fundamental problem with the system, with these systems where you have, whether it's research or whether it's policy, you have taxpayer government money being channeled by people who really don't have neither the manpower nor the tools to determine whether the money, whatever they're funding and whoever they're funding, are producing quality work.
Yeah.
Right. And so, there's a, what economists call a principal agent. There's a moral hazard here. Mm-hmm. There's this massive amount of money. There's no real ways of demonstrating, and the solution is what I go back to is to privatize everything, and let it be fall under the discipline of the market. Meaning, a pharmaceutical company will do its own basic research, and it will end up, because it cannot continue to fund worthless research, because at the end of the day, the product has to make a difference in the marketplace to a patient, and they're going to be competing with other pharmaceutical companies, and so they can only fund the basic science research that they will determine to be, worthwhile, and if they fail, and the company folds.
But that's fine. But Michel, how does that take care of the problem of muckraking journalists that say, well, they're for profit?
Yeah, right.
So you have to push back. I mean, I'm not.
No, they're not. The muckraking journalism only muckraking because these are academic institutions that are non-profit. Yes.
That's not the only reason.
Yes. They cannot internal research. How can they go and check the internal research of a private company?
They'll demand that the tax returns of the company.
No, because the company will have to demonstrate at the level of clinical trials.
They go after the companies all the time because they're private and profit seeking, right? So the key is to say that, look, profit seeking by itself is not some type of inherent bad. You have to do more to say, you can't just say, well, cardiologists make money per stent that they put in. Therefore, cardiologists are putting in too many stents. Okay.
No, but that's not practical. I mean, that's not practical. I mean, how can you have? There are a gazillion papers being published every year in the research literature. You're going to have how many people sort of reanalyze
no, I'm not talking about reanalyzing. I'm saying that, right?
Because people make claims. People make claims. Papers get published. Well, the paper that you criticized got published in, was it JAMA?
Yeah.
Yeah, it got published by JAMA. Therefore, it has been reviewed already by a number of peer reviewers, right? So it went through this.
I'm not saying it shouldn't be published. Go ahead, publish it. Publish your. I mean, that's the only way to do it. You can't have pre-publication censorship or something. Publish everything, and then, but be ready for post-publication, takedowns. And so that's kind of the
right.
That should be. You're right in that we should have a more robust environment that allows for folks to be taken down. Right now, we don't seem to have that.
But that's not. I mean, I don't think it's feasible really, because
why?
What it ends up doing is,
what is the point of going to all these conferences? Everyone goes to AHA. Everyone goes to ACC. There are thousands of.
Except
everyone.
No, the problem is that
thousands of people at these conferences. Our job is not to just simply take in the latest snazzy thing. Our job as physicians, this is our job as physicians, is to critically analyze what's being told to us, and for us to make a judgment about whether or not this is real or not. We need to, I mean, this doesn't fall. This is not. I'm sorry, this is not in ProPublica's wheelhouse. But ProPublica, the only point that these folks have, the journalists have, is that we're not very good at keeping order in our own house. So we have we have, I don't know, we have all these different Me Too drugs that come out, and we turn a blind eye to what drugs cost.
So I mean, you have to take all that into account, and it becomes very, very complicated. I mean, we're not going to be able to.
Yeah. So I'm pushing.
You can't rely on doctors to police themselves by doing the kind of analysis that you've done.
Why not? I mean, I'm some random guy in Philadelphia. Why can't if I can do it? I mean, I'm sure.
But because
the resources can certainly do it.
The problem, I mean, that can occupy you full time. I mean, that can occupy an army of you, and even that wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface. But then, who would be the final adjudicator? Because now this is your opinion, which I find plausible, and perhaps, and I'm hoping a lot of people will find plausible as well. Well, but then others may dispute it, right? So they may be other.
But
and so forth.
I didn't make, but I remember in my article, I did not, at least I don't think I did not come down on one side per se, though it's pretty obvious what my biases are. My biases are that I think the readmission program has not been good and may have increased mortality. That's my bias, and that's what I believe. But my summary of the piece was that, look, these varying analyses of the same problem, they kind of question the whole policy research enterprise. So actually, my question, I mean, we should strongly question any of these policy folks that come out and say this certainly will fix things, or this certainly is on one side or the other. I think social policy, especially health in the healthcare world, is way too complex to be.
I mean, but I think
thought of like that.
In principle, it shouldn't take place. I mean, in principle, there shouldn't be policy like that. That
right,
precisely affects. So not because after the fact we analyze a policy is rolled out. After the fact, we have to examine the data, and there may be. I mean, you've identified one policy, but there've been a gazillion policies for the last 50 years, right?
Yeah. We should have fewer policies. We need fewer policies, right? So we need
correct. But that's a position on principle. It's not a position on the basis of the analysis of the data.
No. That is true, Michel. But no. But that's why I don't think these analyses can be carried out over and over again. I'm not saying that these analyses should be carried. What I'm saying is that you have rare opportunities for these type of analyses to be carried out when the perfect storm hits and you can actually show these things. Most of the time you can't tell and you're like, I don't know. But in this case you can, and this should be used to question all policy. I mean, a lot of policy work that happens, at least the policy work that happens that comes down with like, oh, we have some perfect solution for you that some bureaucrats can solve with some equation of what heart failure readmissions should be. So it's a way to question any technocrat that essentially comes down and says, yes, this is the way we should.
So let me ask you something here, because here there seems to be an asymmetry. I mean, an asymmetry in the sense that so far we've always assumed that, yes, the private sector, pharma, that these, when they roll out the treatment, they're liable to cause death and whatnot. We've known that since, the thalidomide problems and issues even before and so forth. And therefore there's vigilance on that. But for policy, there's not at all the same kind of vigilance, right? Policy, we always assume that, at the most it may be a wash or a waste of money or anything like that. But here it seems that, clearly there's a potential for actual harm from policy, right? The policy killing, right?
History
and that could be game changing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So we need that HARP should be stopped, right? Or immediately paused, at least. Should be the conclusion of. That should be the position that you adopt, right?
Yeah. No.
There should be an immediate moratorium on the HARP.
There's enough uncertainty that I think there should be a moratorium on the HARP.
So how do we go about?
They should do it. I'm sure Seema Verma is listening. So, Seema, please.
We should have her on the show. She should be our next guest because yes, that's right. That's under her purview, or is it under the purview of Secretary Azar?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I remember every time the brief conversations I had with Andy Slavitt on Twitter, and the last image was that
who was the previous CMS administrator,
director of the CMS administrator. Sorry, he would say, "Well, we're just doing what Congress mandated." So I'm honestly I don't know about does it require an act of Congress to now stop HRP? I don't know.
Well, it's part of the ACA, right?
It is.
It's part of the ACA.
there's a lot left to the CMS in terms of how they direct it. They could make the like our favorite president.
Right, he can executive order. Right,
he made the penalty for not getting an ACA plan 0. So you could technically leave HRP in place, but make the penalty for HRP 0.
0. Right, make a big announcement.
That is under the purview, or $1.
Right.
Well,
I think I'd be very happy to if Ms. Seema would Ms. Verma would join us here for a conversation on HRP. I think that would be a very important discussion.
Yes.
Let's wrap it up. Any final words? Anything else you wanted to say about COI that?
No, I think I just want to. I think there's a couple of things. In talking to some folks.
I have a final word, but go ahead. Yes.
Okay. In talking to some folks, the two things are that it's not enough. It's not enough to just yell COI. You have to show that a conflict is somehow changing judgment in a bad way, and I think that's very, very hard to do. And
so I disagree with you on that, because I think I think that's why I want everything to be privatized, because when you privatize things, you don't have conflicts of interest. Right.
Well, you do have conflicts of interest when you privatize things. Why do you say that?
No, not true. No, there's no conflict of interest, because the people funding the research are the people who are going to live and die by it, right? I mean, they're going to be accountable.
No, but then there's going to be a dollar profit motive, Michel. You're not going to be suddenly in a world where journalists.
I mean, when McDonald's doesn't have a conflict of interest when it puts its burger on sale, or when it makes.
Michel,
it's not a conflict of interest.
It's not a conflict.
No, it's not.
Their conflict is they want to sell more burgers.
No, it's not. It's not a. It's their interest. It's not a conflict. It's their interest. Right. There's no conflict.
No.
Right. So the conflict comes about when you're at crossroads, when you're saying one thing. You're right. So
we're having a semantic argument, but
it's not. It's actually a very important.
Well, but regardless of how we. Yes, I understand what you're saying. But regardless of that, if you look back to the early 1900s, before we had the type of regulation, and a lot of research was privatized, right? What happened? You had the same thing. Journalists essentially attacked the enterprise and the status quo as it existed, because it was in the interest of drug companies to not tell you that there was cocaine in whatever they were selling.
Yeah, but that's not true. Right,
so, you're never going to escape a world.
That's not true. No, so
don't go after conflicts, because they'll just say that there's a dollar interest.
That's a Mickey Mouse rendition of history and of the fact of that era. Because if you look at, Merck was producing cocaine and they decided not to market it when they realized that it was addictive. Because they had a reputation to stand by. So Merck pulled out of the cocaine business, and that very early on, before they had any legal mandate to do it or any regulation. So if the product is harmful or whatnot, the company has to make a decision, and so but to go back to finish my last point about COI. So precisely because it's actually very difficult when you have a true COI. Not just that a company is motivated to make money. That's not a COI. That's just their interest. But when you have a conflict of interest, when the person is divided between, two things that they're allegedly trying to do, it's very difficult to tease out to what extent were they influenced by these interests, or to what extent were they influenced by those interests, and things get really murky. And the main one that I want to finish by always saying that doctors who accept third-party payments, that's the largest conflict of interest in healthcare. And it's very difficult to tease out. When you order this echo, are you motivated truly by the additional benefit that it was going to bring to the patient, or are you motivated by the extra income that the echo will generate for you, or with a cath, or with this, or with the repeat visit, and so forth. So. And that, I think, probably, I don't know the amount, but the money is going to be it may not dwarf the other ones, but it's going to be comparable to the others. And that's why I think because conflicts of interest are so pervasive, can be subconscious, and are difficult to analyze, in their effects. That's why it's important for people to recuse themselves from entering. And so my would say, either work for a drug company, or if you're going to be working in research, don't take their money. Don't take their money at all, because it's going to taint your reputation. And same thing with doctors. It's better not to take the money from the insurance company, because it's going you will never be able to tell to what extent it's influencing your decisions, and at the end of the day, it's going to be.
No, it's a
All right.
Fair point.
Anish, thank you. We'll see you next time. I hope you can come back on the show.
I'll try. I'm invited.
All right. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.